never thought a cemetery could breathe, but that was the first impression I had when Harris led me through the gates on my first night shift. The iron bars groaned as they closed behind us, and the sound echoed across the fields of crooked stones as if the earth itself exhaled. The old gravedigger walked ahead without hesitation, his lantern swinging in rhythm with his steps, and I tried to match his pace while pretending that the chill running down my spine was from the November wind. Harris had worked this cemetery longer than I had been alive. His back was bent from decades of labor, but his hands, calloused and cracked, still handled the shovel like an extension of his arm. He had the kind of silence around him that demanded respect, a man whose life had been spent among the dead. When the caretaker retired, I was hired to take the junior post, and the town's administrator had said simply, "Stay close to Harris. He'll tell you what matters." That night I began to understand what he meant. The cemetery was old, older than the town that spread around it, and every step along its gravel paths carried the weight of centuries. Harris named the sections in his gravelly voice: the Victorian Row, the Pauper's Corner, the war graves with white crosses sinking into the ground. The lantern revealed statues of angels with broken wings and crypts whose doors had rusted shut long before my birth. I had expected routine instructions, a list of tasks, perhaps warnings about vandalism or wild dogs. Instead, Harris stopped in front of a fresh mound of earth, plunged his shovel into the soil as if to rest his hand, and looked at me with eyes so pale they seemed carved from the same stone that surrounded us. "There are rules here," he said, his voice steady but low. "Not the kind written in the caretaker's book. Rules you follow if you want to last longer than a season." At first I thought he meant practical advice, like how to avoid injuries or how to deal with grieving families, but the tone in his voice carried something heavier. He gestured to the rows of graves stretching into darkness. "The first rule," he continued, "is never whistle at night in this place." I almost laughed. It sounded absurd, a superstition I might have expected from children daring each other at the gates, not from a man who had dug more graves than anyone in the county. Seeing my expression, Harris shook his head. "Mock it if you want, but the ground listens, and sometimes it answers." He refused to elaborate, just went back to his work, trimming the edges of the fresh grave, his silence thick and immovable. I carried that warning with me as the hours passed. The night was uneventful at first, the kind of monotony that had been described to me as part of the job. We cleaned the tool shed, checked the locks on the mausoleums, and recorded the burial register. The lantern light flickered against stone inscriptions worn by time, and every once in a while, a gust of wind swept dry leaves across the gravel like whispering voices. Somewhere after midnight, while Harris smoked his pipe near the caretaker's hut, I found myself humming under my breath, a nervous habit I had carried since childhood. The tune barely rose to a whistle before Harris's hand clamped down on my shoulder with surprising force. His eyes reflected the lantern flame like those of a cornered animal. "Don't!" he hissed, his grip bruising. "Do you want them to notice you?" He didn't need to explain who they were. His voice and the way he glanced at the graves were explanation enough. I swallowed my protest and nodded. Harris let go, but his gaze lingered on me as if measuring whether I had the sense to survive. We continued in silence, and I forced myself to breathe quietly, each step heavy with the warning I had almost ignored. Around 3 in the morning, fatigue began to dull my mind. The cemetery seemed endless, the rows of stones repeating like patterns in a dream. I caught myself thinking about the rule again, wondering what could possibly happen if one whistled, and almost out of spite, I pursed my lips. But just as the sound was about to escape, the wind carried a thin, high note from somewhere among the graves. It wasn't the wind itself. It had rhythm, deliberate, a whistle rising and falling. I froze, my blood running cold. Harris was ahead of me, lantern swaying, but he stopped too, as if he had heard it. He didn't turn around. "Keep walking," he said firmly, eyes forward. I obeyed, but my gaze betrayed me, sliding toward the rows of old stones. Between the markers I saw nothing but darkness. Yet the whistle came again, clearer, closer, almost mocking. My throat tightened. I wanted to ask Harris who it was, whether someone had entered the grounds, but his command kept me silent. The path beneath my boots felt suddenly fragile, as if the soil itself could give way to something beneath. My heart hammered as we passed the Pauper's Corner, where crude wooden crosses tilted in every direction. The whistling stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving behind only the rattle of branches and the pounding of my pulse. Harris didn't comment, didn't even glance at me. When we reached the caretaker's hut again, he sat on the bench, relit his pipe, and said only, "That was your warning. You won't get another." I spent the remainder of the night in silence, every sound magnified. The scrape of shovels, the rustle of animals in the grass, the distant toll of the church bell marking the hour. But none of it was as haunting as the phantom whistle. It had shape, intent, and something about it felt impossibly human. I couldn't shake the image that someone unseen had been walking just out of sight, testing whether I would answer back. The dawn came slow, painting the statues gray and cold. My relief at leaving the grounds was mixed with shame at my fear, but Harris treated it as ordinary. As we locked the gates, he said, "You made it through the first night. Remember the first rule. Break it again, and you'll find out why we keep it." At home, sleep eluded me. The sound of the whistle lingered in my head, threading through my dreams and dragging me awake before morning. I tried to reason with myself, to explain it as the wind caught in broken marble or the cry of some night bird. Yet no explanation fit the rhythm I had heard, nor the way it seemed to mimic my almost whistle. By the time I returned for the next shift, my skepticism had begun to erode. I found myself scanning the graves for movement, watching the trees for signs of hidden figures, and most of all, pressing my lips tightly shut whenever the urge to hum returned. Harris never mentioned it again, but the silence between us was heavier, a silent pact that what had happened was real, even if neither of us dared to describe it. That was the beginning. One rule whispered in the night, enforced by something neither man nor wind, and I knew then that the cemetery was not just soil and stone. It listened, it remembered, and it had ways of reminding us who truly belonged among the graves. On my second week working under Harris, the November nights had already etched themselves into my bones, but the cemetery itself had begun to feel heavier, as though the ground resented my presence. I walked the paths with more caution than before, careful never to hum or whistle, and the silence that I once found oppressive had become my only shield. Harris didn't lecture me often. His words were measured, always given at the exact moment they mattered. That night, as we made our way past the northern quarter, he stopped so abruptly that I almost collided with him. The lantern's glow threw long shadows across a stretch of bare earth, a patch without stones, without markers, just uneven ground covered in dead leaves. "Second rule," Harris said, his voice lower than usual. "Never step on the unmarked ground." He shifted the lantern closer, and the soil seemed different there, darker, softer, almost as if it pulsed beneath the surface. I thought he was being metaphorical, warning me about sinking soil or collapsed graves, but his eyes remained fixed on that patch as though it might move. We skirted the edge of it, my boots crunching leaves while his steps traced the worn gravel path. Curiosity gnawed at me. Why was that place bare? Cemeteries thrived on order, every body accounted for, every grave marked by stone, cross, or plate. "Why isn't there a marker?" I asked. Harris shook his head, not to silence me, but as if he had answered the question too many times in his life. They were put in the ground without names, without prayers, some by accident, some by choice. Overcrowding, epidemics, old sins. Records were lost, or maybe they were never written. His voice faltered, and for the first time, I saw not just fatigue, but a trace of fear in him. It's not the absence of names that matters. It's what the ground does when you stand on it. He refused to say more, and I carried the unease with me as we finished the rounds. But the seed had been planted. Later, while Harris was busy repairing a fence near the western wall, I lingered by the unmarked patch. I told myself it was harmless curiosity, the same kind that had made me peek into broken mausoleums during daylight. I stepped forward, just an inch past the line where gravel gave way to soil. The ground gave beneath me, not like mud, but like something hollowed out, as if the earth sighed when it felt my weight. My stomach turned. I lifted my foot, but the impression lingered, the soil collapsing slower than it should, like breath drawn in. Then I saw it, the print of my boot filling not with loose dirt, but with a darker shadow, one that shimmered as if wet. I staggered back onto the path, heart hammering, and Harris's hand clamped on my arm so hard I thought he'd bruise the bone. His face, usually calm in its weathered stillness, was carved with anger. "I told you, don't step there. Ever." I stammered an apology, but Harris's eyes were fixed not on me but on the patch of earth, where my footprint had nearly vanished. Something pressed upward, the faintest swell of soil as though something beneath wanted to mirror my step. Harris yanked me away, muttering words under his breath that I couldn't catch. We didn't speak for the rest of the shift, but the silence carried weight, as if he was waiting for me to understand on my own. When dawn finally broke, the image of that swelling ground clung to me like frost. The following night, I asked him outright, "What happens if someone stays on the unmarked ground too long?" He stopped walking, leaned on his shovel, and studied me. "I've seen men sink," he said. "Not like drowning, not like mud. They just went down, slow as sleep, as if the earth decided it wanted them back. We dug once after a boy disappeared there, dug until our hands bled, found nothing. No boy, no body, not even his shoes, just soil, smooth as if it had never been touched." His words drained the blood from my face. "So the ground swallows people?" I whispered. Harris shook his head. "The ground remembers names. If you don't have one to give it, it'll take yours. That's why you don't step there. You keep your name." From that moment, the cemetery changed shape in my mind. The markers were not just stones. They were boundaries, anchors keeping the dead where they belonged. But the unmarked ground was different. It had no anchors, no prayers, no witnesses. It was an open wound, raw and hungry. Each time we passed it on our rounds, I felt its presence, the way you feel a pair of unseen eyes on your back. I began to notice subtle details I had missed before. The way the leaves always gathered thickest there, how animals avoided crossing it, how even in frost the soil seemed damp. Once as we passed, I swore I saw faint depressions in the dirt, as though a dozen hands had pressed upward, then vanished when the lantern's light fell across them. I told myself it was imagination, the product of fatigue and Harris's grim warnings. But the dreams started soon after. In them, I was always walking across the unmarked ground, though my feet made no sound. The soil rippled beneath me, and shadows swirled just beneath the surface, whispering in voices I almost recognized. They said my name, stretching it into something longer, something older. Each time I woke gasping, heart pounding, the sensation of sinking still clinging to my body, as if I had brought it back with me from sleep. On the seventh night, as frost hardened the pathways, I saw something I could no longer dismiss. We were making our final round before dawn when Harris froze and raised his lantern toward the unmarked patch. At first I thought it was mist rising from the soil, but then I saw the impressions. Not boot prints, bare feet. Dozens of them, pressing upward from beneath, each step shallow but perfectly formed, toes curling as if straining for air. I wanted to scream, but Harris shook his head violently, signaling silence. We stood there until the shapes slowly flattened back into soil, leaving nothing but dark earth. Only then did Harris speak, his voice trembling for the first time since I'd met him. "Second rule," he repeated, "never step on the unmarked ground. It doesn't forget footsteps. It only waits for more." I followed him in silence, but inside me something had shifted. The cemetery was no longer a place of the dead resting. It was alive in its own way, and that patch of earth was not empty ground. It was a mouth, and I knew that one day, if I was careless, it would remember the weight of my step and call me back to finish what I had started. By the time I had learned to walk carefully around the unmarked ground, I believed I had earned a sliver of Harris's respect, but the truth was that I had only brushed the edge of what the cemetery demanded. The second rule had burned itself into my memory with such force that even in daylight, when the grounds looked tame and silent, I avoided those bare patches as if they were pits of fire. But the third rule revealed itself not through Harris's warning first. It came as an attack, subtle and intimate, aimed at the one thing that no wall or lantern could protect: my own name. It happened during another long night of exhumation work. Bureaucracy had demanded we unearth an old coffin to make space for a family that had purchased rights to the plot. I remember the metallic taste of frost on the air, the breath pluming white in the lantern light, and the dull rhythm of shovels cutting into frozen earth. The sound was mechanical, familiar, and it steadied me in a way. That was why the first intrusion caught me so off guard. Amid the scrape of spades and Harris's steady grunts, I heard a sound that should not have been there: my mother's voice. It wasn't distorted or faint. It was clear, exactly as I remembered from childhood, carrying the exact cadence she used when calling me in for supper. "Daniel." My name stretched with that half-patient tone only she had. My hands faltered, the spade catching against stone, and for a moment the world narrowed to that sound. It had come from behind me, I was sure, just beyond the edge of lantern light, as if she were waiting near the gates. I turned, my throat already shaping words to answer, and Harris's shovel slammed against the earth like a warning shot. "Don't," he said sharply, without even glancing at me. "Don't you dare answer." I froze. The urge to respond was instinctual, the way a child reacts to a parent's call, automatic and thoughtless. The familiarity of her tone wrapped around me like a noose. Harris's voice, rough and urgent, was the only thing that stopped me. My lips closed, and the silence that followed felt unbearable, like holding my breath underwater. Then, from the dark again, the voice repeated my name, softer, closer, tinged with something that wasn't quite right, an imitation that had learned the melody, but not the soul. "Daniel." My heart thrashed against my ribs. Every instinct screamed that if I answered, she would appear, smiling, alive, impossibly returned. Harris stepped closer, his lantern swinging in front of me as if to shield me. His face was stone, eyes unblinking. "Third rule," he said, his tone quieter now, edged with something almost like pity. "Don't answer if they call your name. Whoever it is, whatever it sounds like, it isn't them." He spoke like a priest repeating a prayer, as though saying the words again would bind me to silence. We stood there for minutes, though it felt like hours. The voice called twice more, shifting, adopting subtle variations, once sounding like my brother, once like Harris himself, which chilled me to the core. Each time the temptation grew heavier, dragging at me like invisible hands, but I clenched my teeth and said nothing. Finally, the cemetery swallowed its own sound, and all that remained was the scrape of our shovels and the faint groan of the coffin we had been tasked to lift. My body trembled with exertion and fear, but Harris worked without pause as though nothing had happened. Only when we lowered the coffin lid onto the cart did he glance at me. "It learns quickly," he said. "If it knows your name, it will wear any voice that matters to you. Don't give it the satisfaction of answering. If you do, it will follow." The weight of his words sank deeper the next evening. I hadn't slept well, my dreams invaded by voices calling me from behind locked doors or across fields of graves. At work, I carried the fatigue like lead. As Harris and I checked the locks on the western crypts, the voice returned, this time from inside the stone chamber itself. My name rolled out in a rasp that echoed against marble, layered and wrong, like my mother's voice played through cracked glass. I clamped my jaw shut, fighting the irrational urge to shout back, to demand what it wanted. Harris struck the side of the crypt with his shovel, the sound sharp enough to make my ears ring, and the voice died mid-syllable. He turned to me and spoke almost kindly. "It only has power if you acknowledge it. Silence starves it. Answering feeds it." That night, as we sat by the caretaker's hut, Harris finally explained. "There are names carved on stones and names carried in the living tongue. The ones in the ground, they want yours. They'll mimic what you love, what you fear, even your own voice. They'll trade nothing, give nothing. All they want is the opening your reply creates." His eyes wandered toward the dark rows of graves, and his pipe smoke curled like breath. "I've seen men answer. Sometimes they vanish. Sometimes they live, but they're not themselves anymore. Empty, like the earth echoed back and took their voice away." I didn't ask for details. The silence between us was thick enough, but I knew then that the cemetery wasn't only a place of bones and soil, it was a predator, and our voices were bait. In the weeks that followed, the temptation never left. Each night I heard the call at least once. Sometimes a friend, sometimes a stranger, sometimes my own voice whispered from behind me. Each time I clenched my jaw until it ached, my throat burning with the effort not to answer. I came to understand the cruelty of it. The more you craved a voice, the more convincing it became. By the end of that week, I was terrified not of death, but of speaking. The third rule became a brand on my mind. Don't answer if they call your name. I wondered how many names the cemetery had already stolen, how many echoes lingered in its soil, waiting for someone weak enough to respond. And though Harris never said it, I sensed he carried his own losses, names he had once failed to protect. As I left that night, the wind carried faint syllables across the stones, almost inaudible, but close enough to stir my blood. I kept my mouth shut, my breath tight in my chest, and the cemetery listened, patient, waiting for the day my silence might break. By the time I had endured the whispers of the third rule, silence had become second nature to me. I no longer trusted the sound of my own voice in the cemetery, afraid that even a word could betray me. Harris seemed almost satisfied by this change, as though the place itself was slowly teaching me the lessons he once had to deliver directly. Yet there was one place he still avoided, one corner of the cemetery, that even he, the man who had spent his entire life among the graves, would not linger near unless duty forced his hand. It stood at the eastern edge, where the land rose into a small hill and the old stone steps, cracked and bent, led up to a mausoleum older than the nation itself. That was where I learned the fourth rule: never shine your lantern into the old mausoleum. The first time Harris mentioned it, we were repairing a rusted gate nearby. The moon hung low, its pale glow spilling over the hill, outlining the mausoleum in broken silver. The structure loomed with an authority none of the newer crypts possessed. Its stone was darker, pitted and scarred by centuries, and the door was barred not just with iron, but with heavy chains that looked more ceremonial than practical. Harris stopped me as I lifted the lantern instinctively to get a better look. His hand, gnarled and cold, pressed down on mine with surprising force. "Fourth rule," he muttered, his voice hushed even though no one else was near. "Don't shine the lantern in there, not unless you want to see what isn't meant for your eyes." He turned away without further explanation, but his grip had left an ache in my wrist, and I felt the weight of his warning settle in my gut. The mausoleum became a fixation for me. Each night I would glance at it out of the corner of my eye, wondering what secrets it held. Its architecture was unlike the others, more brutal, almost primitive, as though it had been carved before records were kept. Moss clung to its sides like veins, and the air around it seemed denser, colder, even in the warmth of summer nights. When I asked Harris who was buried there, he only shrugged. Older than me, older than my father, maybe older than the town. Names were carved, then erased by weather. Don't matter anymore. His dismissal was too quick, too rehearsed, and I knew he was hiding something. Weeks passed before my curiosity broke through my caution. One night, while Harris busied himself mending a tool handle near the caretaker's hut, I found myself walking up the cracked steps alone. The hill was unnervingly silent, as though the wind avoided it, leaving the air heavy and stagnant. I held the lantern low, trying to respect Harris's warning, but each step seemed to draw me closer to disobedience. At the top, standing before the chained door, I felt the overwhelming pull to know. The lantern's flame danced against my boots, threatening to rise higher, and before I realized what I was doing, I lifted it. The light spilled across the iron bars, glinting off rust, and pressed through the cracks of the chained door. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then the flame shifted, bending toward the darkness as though sucked inward. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the night air, but the shadows inside the mausoleum moved. They didn't scatter or retreat from the light. They leaned into it, twisting, coiling like smoke with intent. My breath caught as faint shapes emerged, half-formed, outlines of figures pressed against the stone walls as if straining to escape. Their faces were indistinct, yet I swore I recognized expressions. Sorrow, rage, hunger. One shape pressed forward, almost visible, and I saw its mouth open soundlessly, wider than any mouth should. "Put it down." Harris's voice cracked like a whip behind me, but I was rooted to the spot, transfixed by the sight. The lantern flame trembled violently, elongating toward the door, its warmth draining from my hand until the handle felt icy. Harris rushed up the steps, his hand slamming the lantern downward. The light hit the stone steps, breaking the connection, and the shadows recoiled instantly, vanishing into the depths of the mausoleum like insects fleeing from fire. The air snapped back into place, a rush of wind that hadn't been there moments before. My knees buckled, and Harris shoved me back down the steps, his face twisted in anger and fear. "What did I tell you?" he snarled once we reached the path again. His voice was louder than I'd ever heard, not the calm authority I was used to. "Fourth rule, keep the lantern away. The light draws them. They wait for it. That's how they see us." He spat into the dirt as if to rid himself of the taste of the moment, then walked ahead, leaving me shaken. I didn't follow immediately, too busy trying to steady my hands, which trembled as though the cold of that shadow had seeped into my bones. The nightmares came that same night. I dreamed of the mausoleum door unchained, of the lantern's flame pulling me inside, of shadows crowding around me with faces half familiar, calling me by names I didn't know I had. I woke drenched in sweat, the memory so vivid I had to convince myself I was still in my bed, not locked in that ancient tomb. When I returned to work, Harris treated me with distant civility. He didn't mention the incident again, but every time we passed the hill, he kept his lantern low and his pace quick, and I mirrored him without protest. Yet the damage had been done. I had seen what the light revealed, and I knew now why Harris kept that rule unbroken. The mausoleum wasn't just a resting place. It was a cage. Whatever lay inside wasn't meant for living eyes, and the lantern's flame was no longer my shield but their invitation. As we finished the round that night, Harris finally muttered, almost to himself, "Some graves hold bodies. That one holds hunger. Best to leave it starving." The fourth rule etched itself into my memory as deeply as the others, and though I promised myself I would never lift the lantern toward that door again, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows had seen me, recognized me, and were waiting for the night I forgot myself long enough to lift the light once more. The bell tower of the cemetery chapel was a relic like everything else on those grounds, a crooked structure of stone and timber whose foundations had seen more funerals than any living soul could remember. On my first weeks, I had dismissed it as just another ornament of tradition, something for mourners to cling to when words failed them. Yet Harris treated the tower with the same wary distance he gave the unmarked ground and the old mausoleum. He never said it directly, but I could see the way his jaw tightened when the rope swayed, when the sound of the bronze carried over the fields of graves. He always looked down at the soil instead of up at the tower. It wasn't until the winter set in fully, the earth hardening to stone beneath our boots, that I finally learned why. That evening we had buried a man from the town, a figure I barely knew but Harris seemed to remember from long ago. The ritual was sparse, the family small, the priest's words short and dutiful. But as the casket lowered and the last handfuls of earth thudded against its lid, the bell began to toll. One heavy note for each life laid to rest, that was the tradition. The slow swing of the clapper resonating through the air like a heartbeat too large for the world. The mourners bowed their heads. The priest clasped his Bible tighter, and Harris's face grew pale as the sound carried. He touched my arm and leaned close enough for me to feel his breath. "Fifth rule," he whispered. "Don't count the bells." I wanted to laugh at first. Counting was harmless. It was natural to mark the tolls, to measure them. But Harris's tone silenced me. His gaze wasn't on the tower but on the graves, his lips pressed into a thin line as though each peal struck him physically. The bell tolled again, then again, and though I tried to ignore them, my mind betrayed me. I counted in silence. 3, 4, 5. The sound seemed to stretch, each toll dragging longer, the vibrations crawling into my chest. By the seventh toll, the mourners had begun to murmur, confused, their faces lifting toward the tower as though expecting to see someone still pulling the rope. Yet the rope had stopped. The priest's hands trembled against his book, and Harris's grip tightened on my sleeve until it hurt. "Stop it," he hissed, though I hadn't spoken. "Don't you dare." But the bell rang on. 8, 9, 10. My heart stumbled as I realized no one stood in the tower, no figure against the lantern glow, no hand upon the rope. Yet the clapper swung, visible in the brief flashes of light through the slits of stone. It moved as though driven not by gravity, but by intent. Each toll echoed differently now, distorted, layered with tones I could not name, as if a second voice rang with the first, deeper and older, resonating from beneath the earth rather than above it. By the 12th toll, the mourners were silent, their confusion hardening into fear. The priest stammered a final prayer and hurried them away. Only Harris and I remained by the open ground, frozen as the sound rolled on. At the 13th toll, something shifted. The soil beneath the fresh grave shuddered as though something far below stirred at the sound. The mound of earth sagged, then swelled, and for a moment I thought the coffin lid would splinter upward. Harris yanked me back from the grave's edge, his eyes burning. "It listens when you count," he said hoarsely. "It knows you're keeping track." The bell struck again, louder, and I realized my lips had been moving unconsciously, counting under my breath. 14. I clamped my mouth shut, terror coursing through me. The bell struck 15, then 16, until finally, with one last bone-rattling peal, the sound cut off. The silence afterward was suffocating, the entire cemetery holding its breath. Harris dragged me away, his grip iron. We didn't speak until we reached the caretaker's hut. His pipe lay forgotten on the table as he stared at me, his face drawn. "Never count them," he said finally, his voice like gravel. "Not in your head, not with your lips, not even once. If you count, it thinks you're answering. And if you answer, you're promising." I wanted to ask promising what, but his expression warned me that I didn't want the answer. That night I couldn't sleep. The tolls echoed in my mind, each one replaying in perfect clarity, as though etched into my skull. I tried to break the sequence, to imagine other sounds, but the count marched on no matter what I did. 3, 4, 5, all the way to 16, each number heavy as stone. At some point I realized I wasn't recalling the sound at all. I was still hearing it, faint, distant, beneath the noise of the city, beneath the hum of the world. It was as though the bell had anchored itself inside me, tolling endlessly below the level of hearing, a rhythm only my bones could feel. When I returned to work, Harris didn't ask how I slept. He already knew. His eyes studied me as though searching for cracks. I noticed he kept his distance whenever the bell rang, muttering under his breath, never once looking up. I tried to mimic him, but the temptation gnawed at me. Every time the bell struck, I felt my mind marking the number, tallying against my will. Once I slipped and whispered 3 under my breath before clamping my mouth shut. The earth near the chapel shifted, a faint ripple of soil, subtle but undeniable, as though something had pricked its ears at my acknowledgement. The fifth rule was simple on its surface, yet cruel in its execution. To survive, you had to resist the most natural instinct, to measure, to count, to understand. The bell was not just a signal for the living, it was a summons, and each number was a door. Harris never explained what would happen if the count reached the end, if one were foolish enough to mark every toll. He didn't have to. I had seen the soil swell, the coffin strain against the earth, the shadow in the bell's voice. I knew then that the tower did not belong to us, not truly. It belonged to the cemetery itself, and its tolls were not just for the dead we buried, but for something deeper, something that counted us in return. The fifth rule became my cage. Each time the bell sounded, I clenched my fists, bit my tongue, and prayed for silence. But prayers, I learned, carried little weight here. What mattered was discipline. What mattered was not letting the cemetery trick you into becoming part of its count. Winter had settled over the cemetery like a shroud, hardening the ground and driving the air into our lungs with a sting that felt almost metallic. By then, I thought I had begun to understand Harris's world, the rhythm of nights punctuated by silent patrols, the avoidance of certain places, and the restraint of never answering, never counting. Yet for all the weight of the earlier rules, nothing prepared me for the night I learned the sixth. It came not as a warning in advance, but as an ambush, sprung from the soil itself. The night began uneventfully, a bitter wind slicing across the rows of stones as we made our usual rounds. Harris led with his lantern low, the orange glow cutting narrow tunnels through the dark, and I followed, boots crunching over frost-hardened gravel. When we passed the pauper's corner, the wind shifted and carried with it an odor that was all wrong. Not the usual damp earth or faint rot, but something sharp, coppery, like blood mingled with wet stone. Harris's pace slowed, and I saw his shoulders stiffen beneath his coat. Then he lifted the lantern, and the sight froze my breath in my chest. Ahead of us, a grave yawned open. The soil was scattered in uneven heaps, not the neat mounds left by our own shovels, but clawed outward, as though the earth itself had ruptured. The coffin inside lay splintered, its lid broken, its interior empty. No family had requested an exhumation. No work order existed for that plot. It had opened itself. I stepped closer, curiosity battling with dread, but Harris's arm shot out like a barrier. His grip on my chest was iron. His voice, though steady, carried an edge sharper than the wind. Sixth rule: don't stay if you find a grave open by itself. His eyes never left the pit, and his knuckles whitened on the lantern's handle. I wanted to ask why, wanted to demand an explanation, but the words lodged in my throat. Something in the air around the grave pressed down on me, a heaviness that made each breath laborious, as though the soil itself was exhaling a pressure meant to drive us back. Despite his warning, I couldn't help leaning forward, lantern light catching the jagged splinters of the coffin. The interior bore scratches, long and desperate, etched deep into the wood from the inside out. They were too erratic for tools, too frenzied to be anything but hands. My stomach lurched. Someone Someone got out, I whispered before I could stop myself. Harris didn't look at me, his eyes locked on the darkness within the hole. Not someone, he said grimly. Something. And it doesn't go far once it's free. The soil at the bottom shifted, a subtle ripple like water disturbed by a stone. My instincts screamed to flee, but fascination rooted me there. The dirt bulged slightly, as if something pressed against it from below, searching for purchase. I thought of the unmarked ground, of the way it had seemed to breathe, and realized this was worse. It wasn't waiting to swallow, it was forcing its way out. Then, as if answering my thought, a faint sound drifted upward, a scraping, like nails dragging along wood, though there was no coffin lid left to scratch. Harris yanked my arm, hard enough to tear me from the edge. "We don't stay," he growled, half dragging me down the path. "Not a second longer than we have to. You stay, and it follows you. It doesn't matter where you run, it will know the weight of your step." His words weren't metaphor. His fear was real, carved into the deep lines of his face. I stumbled to keep pace, my heart slamming against my ribs, the image of those claw marks seared into my mind. That night I barely slept, but when I did, the dreams came. I saw open graves across the cemetery, each one spilling soil like wounds. From them emerged figures not whole, not rotting corpses, but shapes of earth-given form, their limbs brittle yet strong, their mouths packed with dirt as they whispered through cracked jaws. They whispered my name, but unlike the voices from the third rule, these did not tempt me to answer. They promised pursuit. I woke with the taste of soil on my tongue. The following evening, I pressed Harris for more. "What happens to the bodies?" I asked as we walked. "The ones that get out." He shook his head. "Don't call them bodies. Bodies rest. Those don't." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes animals go missing near the grounds. Sometimes people wander too close after dark. And sometimes nothing is missing, but you find prints in the frost, bare feet where no one should have walked. That's when you know one of them is loose." His explanation left me cold. I began noticing the details he had spoken of. Faint depressions along the paths that matched no shoe I knew, paw prints of strays that stopped suddenly mid-stride, as if the animal had simply ceased to exist. Once, while locking a gate, I saw a smear of blood across the stone, but no body to account for it. Harris said nothing, just scraped it clean with the edge of his shovel and muttered a prayer under his breath. From then on, every round became a test of my nerve. Each grave we passed seemed a potential trap, each mound of earth a lid that could break open without warning. And whenever I saw soil disturbed in ways that didn't match our work, I quickened my pace, remembering Harris's words, "Don't stay, never linger." The cemetery had rules because it demanded respect, but the sixth rule was different. It wasn't respect the open graves wanted, it was fear. They wanted you to look too long, to lean too close, to give them the chance to mark you. I obeyed as best I could, but even now when I close my eyes, I see that first open grave. I see the coffin's interior shredded by frantic hands, the soil shifting with hunger, the emptiness above that said something had left. And I know Harris was right. Whatever escapes does not leave the cemetery. It waits. It learns your step. And one night, when the earth breaks again, it will climb out and follow. By the time I learned the sixth rule, I believed I had glimpsed the worst the cemetery had to offer. Graves that opened themselves, coffins clawed apart from the inside, soil shifting like muscle. Yet Harris warned me there was one rule left, and he spoke of it with a reluctance unlike the others. The first six were carved into his routine, delivered with a soldier's precision, but the seventh seemed to weigh on him, as though even repeating it aloud was dangerous. He only muttered it once, in the dead of winter when I arrived for the shift looking pale and shaken from a night of restless sleep. "Seventh rule," he said without preamble, his eyes narrowing on me like a man who recognized symptoms. "Don't write the names you see in dreams." I didn't understand at first. It sounded absurd, trivial compared to the terror of open graves and whispering voices. But Harris wasn't joking. His gaze pinned me with such intensity that I felt as though he could see into the restless night I had just endured. The dreams where gravestones shimmered in the fog, each bearing a name I had never seen before. Some were names so old they tasted of dust when I whispered them in my head. Others so ordinary I was sure they belonged to real people somewhere in town. I hadn't told Harris about them, but the way his voice cracked as he said the rule told me he already knew. That night I swore I wouldn't remember the dreams again, that they were nothing but tricks of exhaustion. But the cemetery doesn't release its hold so easily. Each shift I left more drained than the one before, and each morning I returned home to collapse into uneasy sleep. And always, the dreams came. They weren't like normal dreams, scattered and illogical. They were precise, ordered. I walked among rows of gravestones that stretched into a mist without end. Every marker was perfectly legible, as though carved yesterday, and each bore a name I had never read before. Sometimes the stones glowed faintly, as if lit from within. Other times they dripped moisture like sweat. I would trace the names with my eyes, repeating them in my mind, compelled by some unseen hand to remember them. The first time I broke the rule was without realizing. I woke from one of those dreams and, still groggy, scribbled a name on the notebook by my bed, the way one records fragments before they vanish. The name was Eliza Crammond. It meant nothing to me, but the moment I finished the last letter, a cold dread filled my room, thick and suffocating. I tore the page out and burned it over the stove, but the letters seared themselves into my memory. That evening, as Harris and I walked the cemetery grounds, I froze at the edge of a section I had never visited before. There it was, a cracked headstone leaning under the weight of moss, the inscription weathered but unmistakable. Eliza Crammond, 1813-1841. The dates blurred as if the stone itself resisted my gaze, but the name was identical. I told Harris what had happened, and his reaction frightened me more than the coincidence. His face turned ashen, and for a long time he said nothing, just stared at the stone as if expecting it to split open. Finally, he muttered, "That's why you don't write them. Writing makes them permanent. Writing is an invitation." When I pressed him for more, he shook his head. "Every name has weight. Some are meant to stay buried. Put them on paper, carve them in memory, and you give them another anchor." After that, the dreams grew more aggressive. The names no longer waited passively on the stones. They sang themselves into my thoughts, whispered in unison, pressing at my skull until I felt I might scream. I began waking with the taste of earth on my tongue, as though I had been breathing soil all night. My hands sometimes twitched as if longing to reach for a pen. More than once I woke to find my notebook pulled closer to my bed than I remembered leaving it, the pencil lying neatly across the page. I stopped keeping them in the room, but still, the compulsion lingered. Harris tried to help in his own way, though his patience wore thin. He told me stories of others before me who had ignored the seventh rule. A groundskeeper in the 1950s who kept detailed journals of the names he saw. He vanished within a year, his body never found, but the journal remained. Every name written in it matched graves from centuries before. Another, a junior worker like me, scribbled names in chalk on the stones themselves. Within weeks, mourners reported seeing figures near those graves at night, shapes that carried their own headstones like burdens on their backs. Harris's voice cracked when he spoke of that, his fear raw. The names call themselves back one by one if you give them the letters to stand on. The worst came one night when I slipped again, though I didn't mean to. I woke from a dream with a name pounding in my skull, repeating itself with the cadence of a bell. My lips moved before I realized, whispering it into the darkness. Thomas Lyle. I never wrote it, but even speaking it out loud felt like a violation. At work the following night, Harris turned pale the moment I said I hadn't slept. He led me to a forgotten corner of the cemetery, where the ground sloped unevenly and the stones leaned like drunkards. Without saying a word, he held the lantern over one cracked marker. The engraving was faint, nearly eroded, but it was there. Thomas Lyle, 1799, 1826. My legs weakened, and I gripped the stone for balance. The dream had been real. The cemetery was feeding me its own memory, one name at a time. Harris's anger then was different from the fury he'd shown at the mausoleum. This was desperation. He grabbed my collar and pulled me close, his breath harsh. "You think this place speaks because you're special? It speaks because you're weak. It will fill your head with names until you're nothing but a walking register. And when you write the last one, you'll lie down in the soil and become another voice whispering them." His words stung, not just because of the insult, but because of the truth I felt in them. From then on, I fought the dreams with every ounce of will I had. I avoided sleep until exhaustion dragged me under, and still the names came. I bit my tongue to stop from speaking them, clenched my fists to keep from writing. Yet I knew it was only a matter of time before one slipped through again. The cemetery was patient, It had centuries to wait. The seventh rule wasn't just a warning, it was a doom postponed. And each night as I walked those grounds, I wondered if Harris had once written a name himself, if that was why his eyes always seemed to carry more weight than his shoulders could bear. He never said. He didn't need to. The silence between us was filled with the names we refused to give shape to. By the time the seventh rule carved itself into my nerves, my nights in the cemetery had become a slow descent into a private purgatory. I no longer separated the hours I spent behind those gates from the hours I spent outside them. Sleep was just another extension of the same place, the same voices, the same gnawing insistence that rules were not meant to protect me, but to delay the inevitable. Harris had given me the full litany, 7 laws spoken in tones of command, yet my own weakness had already betrayed me. I had whistled, if only for an instant, and something had whistled back. I had stepped onto unmarked ground and felt the soil breathe beneath my weight. I had nearly answered the voices that called my name, had lifted my lantern toward the old mausoleum, and seen shadows lean into the light. I had counted the tolls of the chapel bell until they no longer stopped at the proper number. I had lingered too close to an open grave and watched the earth stir, and in my half-conscious desperation I had whispered a name from my dreams into the air. Piece by piece, the cemetery had marked me. The changes began subtly, almost easy to dismiss. A scrape of soil in my room that could be explained as dirt tracked on my boots. A whistle in the distance that could be mistaken for wind threading through broken shingles. But soon the excuses frayed. I would wake in my small flat to find leaves scattered on the floor, damp and black with rot, though my windows were latched. I began to hear the toll of a bell at times when the chapel stood silent, its clapper unmoving, the sound bleeding faintly through my chest as though my ribs themselves were resonating. My dreams no longer ended when I opened my eyes. I would find myself half awake, staring at the notebook on my desk, convinced I had written names across its pages though it lay blank. Sometimes I woke with the taste of soil so thick in my mouth that I coughed mud into the sink. Harris noticed before I dared admit it. One night, as we crossed the northern path, he stopped me and held the lantern close to my face. His eyes searched me like a physician diagnosing rot. "You've broken them all, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words died. He didn't need confirmation. My silence was enough. He sighed, a sound more weary than angry. "Then you've invited them, all of them. The rules aren't just commandments, they're locks, and you've left every door cracked." I wanted him to tell me what to do, how to undo the damage, but Harris only shook his head. "There's no turning back once they know you. You can survive a long while if you keep discipline, but each breach ties you closer. In time, you stop being a visitor and start being part of the place." His lantern trembled slightly as he said it, and for the first time I wondered if he too had broken rules in his youth, if that was why his face always looked carved from grief. The proof of his warning arrived soon after. During a night shift alone, Harris had been called away by some administrative duty. I patrolled the western rows, lantern in hand. The bell began to toll, though no funeral was scheduled, and the numbers marched unbidden in my head. I bit my tongue, but blood only sharpened the count. 9, 10, 11. At the 12th toll, a voice rose from the soil at my feet, the very earth-shaping syllables. It was my own voice, perfect in every tone, whispering a name I had not written but had dreamed. The name echoed between the graves until the stones themselves seemed to vibrate with it. Against all reason, my throat opened to answer, to complete the conversation I hadn't realized I had begun. I caught myself only because the lantern flickered, and for a split second, the flame bent not forward, but downward, toward the grave beneath me, as though drawn to the mouth forming in the dirt. I stumbled back, heart slamming, and fled toward the caretaker's hut. But the cemetery didn't let me leave unscathed. From the corner of my eye, I saw a figure pacing me between the rows, barefoot, gaunt, its skin the color of soil. It never came into full view, always half swallowed by shadow, but its presence was undeniable. I knew without needing to ask. It was what had crawled from an open grave, what waited for those who lingered too long, and now it had found me. When Harris returned, I told him what I had seen, though my voice shook with the weight of it. His face hardened, but his eyes carried a glint of sorrow. "That's the price," he said simply. "You can't break them without paying. Every rule is a wall, and you've torn them down one by one. Now the cemetery doesn't just know you, it owns you. From that night on, I was never alone, even when I left the grounds. The footsteps followed me home, soft and bare, echoing in stairwells, in hallways, in the quiet outside my door. Names etched themselves on the edges of my vision, on billboards, in newspapers, words rearranging until they matched the dream stones. Sometimes I caught myself humming without meaning to, and always, faintly, a second whistle would answer. The lantern I once trusted now filled me with dread, for each time I lit it, shadows grew too eager, leaning toward me as if in recognition. I understood then that the rules weren't meant to protect the living from superstition. They were meant to protect the living from becoming prey, and I had in my weakness become marked prey. The cemetery was patient. It would not consume me all at once. It would peel me slowly, voice by voice, step by step, until one night I would answer, or count too far, or write one name too many, and then the soil would finally claim me, not as a body buried, but as a rule broken beyond repair. The winter that followed was colder than any in memory, and Harris seemed to wither with it. His cough grew heavier, his hands shook more often as he gripped the lantern, and the weight of decades bent his back until he seemed half buried already. I could see the graveyard tightening around him, as if it had been waiting for this moment, its veteran gravedigger at the end of his strength. For weeks, I feared he would not last the season, and when the day came that he did not appear for our shift, I knew before anyone told me. Harris was gone. The official account was ordinary. He had died quietly in his sleep, no family to claim him, his body taken by the town for burial elsewhere. The other caretakers muttered that it was ironic, a man who had spent his life among the dead not being buried where he worked. But I knew better. Harris's absence wasn't coincidence. It was avoidance. He had kept himself out of this ground by force of will, and when his body failed, others ensured it was placed beyond these gates. Perhaps it was his final command, perhaps a promise extracted long ago. Whatever the reason, his coffin never touched this soil. The cemetery would have claimed him instantly if it had. I was left alone to shoulder the rules, but worse, I was left with the gnawing certainty that Harris had carried secrets deeper than any he'd spoken aloud. I began searching the caretaker's hut, rifling through drawers, notebooks, and locked chests. Most contained nothing but routine records, names and dates of burials, maps of sections, supply receipts. But one night, hidden beneath loose boards in the floor, I found a small tin box. Inside was a collection of yellowed scraps of paper, brittle with age, each covered in Harris's tight, angular handwriting. They weren't work notes. They were confessions. The scraps described rules in more detail than he had ever shared. The first paper told of his youth, of the night he had whistled and awoken something that whistled back for weeks. Another recounted how he had stepped onto unmarked ground and felt it cling to his boots until he could not move, saved only by another gravedigger who yanked him free. He described hearing his wife's voice after her death, calling him from the graves, and how it had taken everything he had not to answer. The mausoleum he described in words darker still, how one winter he had shown his lantern into its depths and seen not shadows, but faces of every gravedigger who had died before him, their mouths open in silent screams. He admitted to counting once, to following the bells until the 15th toll, when the soil beneath his feet had split, and he had barely dragged himself away before something clawed upward. And then came the worst confession. In shaky ink he admitted to staying too long by an open grave. He had seen something rise, shapeless, crawling, dragging its body of soil, and it had followed him for years, leaving prints at his door, whispering through the walls. The 7th rule was his greatest shame. He had written names, dozens of them, in a notebook long destroyed, and afterward, he could never forget them. He saw those names on passing buses, in shop windows, in the sky when clouds broke. He burned the notebook, but it didn't matter. The names lived in him. At the bottom of the tin was a single folded sheet, unlike the rest. On it, Harris had scrawled in larger, uneven letters, "The rules don't protect you. They bind you. Break them, and the cemetery owns you. Keep them, and you spend your life in debt. There's no escape, only delay." I sat in that hut for hours, lantern sputtering low, the cold creeping into my bones, and I understood then why Harris had never spoken the full truth aloud. He hadn't wanted me to see that the rules were not safeguards but chains. He had obeyed them all his life, and still he had broken them, one by one, until he was nothing more than a caretaker, stretched thin between survival and surrender. And when the cemetery finally came to claim him, he fought not to be buried there, not because he hated the place, but because he knew if he lay in that soil, he would never rest. He would become another whisper, another face pressing at the mausoleum door. In the nights that followed, I began to notice things Harris had hidden with his presence. Without him, the cemetery seemed louder. The bell tolled more often. The voices called more persistently. The open graves appeared with increasing frequency. Perhaps he had been a dam all along, holding back the flood, and with his death the pressure burst free. I felt them circling me, the rules I had broken pressing their prices against my skin. Whistles followed me through the paths. Footsteps rose from unmarked ground. My name came in choruses now, not single voices. The mausoleum pulsed with hunger whenever my lantern strayed too close. The bells never rang the same number twice. And once, returning to the caretaker's hut, I found the door ajar, and inside, on the desk where Harris had once smoked and scrawled his notes, a page I had not written, covered in names I had only ever seen in dreams. It was then I realized the truth Harris had carried into his grave. He had not survived because he was stronger than the rules. He had survived because the cemetery had allowed him to, for a time. The rules didn't keep us safe. They kept us tethered. And now, with him gone, the tether had passed to me. I write this now by the flicker of a dying candle, though even as the words leave my hand, I know I am breaking the last rule in the most absolute way. Harris told me once that the seventh rule was the most dangerous, that to write the names was to grant them permanence, to anchor them into the world again. But what I've learned since his death is worse still. It isn't just the names that summon. It is any attempt to trap the cemetery's truths in ink. Every letter is a doorway, every sentence a key. I feel the weight of this pen like a shovel in my grip, each line another cut into soil that should have remained closed. Yet if I don't write, if I don't leave something behind, then Harris's life and mine both dissolve into silence, and the cemetery will have consumed us without witness. The days have blurred into nights since Harris was buried far away, his absence leaving the cemetery louder and hungrier than ever. The whispers no longer wait for darkness. They thread into my mind at all hours, invading even my brief escapes into town. A whistle drifts through the market, faint and mocking. A name appears in the grain of wood at the butcher's stall. The bell tolls in my chest when no tower stands above me. And always, when I return to the grounds, I find something shifted. A grave slightly open, though no one has been interred. Soil pressed with prints that match my own boots, though I have not walked there. Pages lying on my desk, covered in words I swear I did not write. The cemetery is no longer confined to its fences. It has bled outward into me, and I carry it wherever I go. I tried resisting at first. I destroyed the papers Harris left, burned them to ash, but still the knowledge clung. I threw away my notebooks, yet awoke one night with dirt-smeared words scrawled across my walls in my own handwriting. I avoided sleep, drinking black coffee until my hands shook, but exhaustion only made the dreams stronger. And in those dreams the cemetery is endless, rows upon rows of stones stretching into fog, everyone bearing a name I feel compelled to memorize. When I wake, the names linger, echoing like prayers I never meant to learn. Sometimes they appear carved faintly into my skin, raised like welts before fading by morning. I know what that means. The cemetery doesn't need me to write anymore. It is writing through me. I hear Harris's voice sometimes, not as one of the imitations the ground throws at me, but as memory. The rules don't protect you. They bind you. I understand him now. His entire life was spent dancing on the edge of those chains, obeying just enough to delay the collapse. I thought I was unlucky for breaking them, but I see now that breaking was inevitable. The rules are not commandments, but traps, lines drawn so we believe we have choices. The truth is simpler and crueler. Every gravedigger, every caretaker, every poor soul bound to that place ends the same way. Consumed, rewritten, absorbed into the silence of the soil. Even now I feel the pull. The unmarked ground calls with each step, soft and yielding, promising to remember me if I only offer my weight. The mausoleum hums when my lantern passes, shadows pressing against the cracks as though eager to see my face again. The bell counts itself, its tolls spilling into numbers no human tongue should recite. And at the edge of every dream, An open grave waits, its clawed coffin asking for me to lean closer, to stay just long enough to be marked. The names crawl behind my eyes, begging for the pen, promising release if I just let them out. So I write, knowing what it means. I write because silence is worse. Harris carried these truths into his grave, hidden in scraps of paper, terrified of what permanence might summon. I cannot follow his caution. I need someone, anyone, to read this and understand that the cemetery is not just a place of the dead. It is a living hunger, a memory that feeds itself through us. It does not stop at the gates. It waits wherever its rules are broken, wherever someone is foolish enough to whistle, to answer, to count, to dream, to write. It has waited for centuries, and it will wait for you. When this candle dies, I suspect I will die with it, though not in any way recognizable. I will not be found in a coffin, nor beneath marked soil. Perhaps I will become another whisper, another name etched on the inside of someone's skull, another shadow leaning toward the lantern light. Perhaps you will dream of me, my name appearing on a stone in fog, and you will wake with the urge to write it down. If you do, I will be yours, and you will be mine, and the cycle will continue. That is the cemetery's true rule, the unwritten one Harris never admitted but must have known. We are not caretakers. We are offerings stretched thin until we break. So I write my last confession here, knowing I am already too far gone. The rules are not guidelines. They are graves waiting to be dug. Break them, and the cemetery owns you. Keep them, and it waits until you slip. Either way, the earth is patient. It always wins. And if you are reading this now, if you have carried these words into your own mind, then the rules are yours too. The whisper has found you. The toll has begun, and you must choose. Will you obey, or will you break? It will not matter in the end. The cemetery never forgets.